Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. My name is Maria. Welcome to Mosaic Maria, my channel. So, as promised, I wanted to do a video series on grief and a few things, the different types of grief and different reactions to grief, and what we can do to get past grief. And in order to do that, I am going to be reading from some linkage and sources, and I'll give my sources. So I'm going to try to get to another page from here without losing you. I don't have the ability to stream right now and share a screen. So I want to talk about, I posted a video of me eating a lot of pizza. No, not a lot. I ate one slice, but for me, it's very filling to eat a slice of pizza because I also had some eggplant parm. So that video is up there, and that is my intro to grief. And the reason it is a grief subject with food is that oftentimes when a loved one passes away, or when we're losing that person in our life, or we're missing a person, we will go back to memory foods from younger years or things they liked to cook or cooked well, which is why we always go back to our grandma's chicken soup, our grandma's, because these things comfort us. Our grandmothers, our mother made a favorite cake, our father made potatoes a certain way or grilled a certain way. So foods are a primary basic need and serve as a purpose. So do smells and aromas. The aroma of vanilla, the aroma of baby powder, the aroma of cinnamon. These are all the things that we remember as children. Maybe a cinnamon roll or cinnamon and sugar on toast or in our cereal. Butter, bacon. So many aromas. It will be different for every culture and different for everyone that has a different cuisine, right? But there are family favorites. And in my family, my dad owned a pizza restaurant, which I've talked about a lot. And eventually it was publicly franchised owned. And my brother owned the business, and then many people owned franchises. So it went public. But I grew up in the pizza business. When my parents got divorced, I started wanting to visit my dad on the weekends. I had been visiting my dad on the weekends, but it was pretty much before he had the pizza shop. We were pretty much just going to my grandma and grandpa's on Sunday dinner, and then I was coming home, and that was great. Sometimes we were going to Powder Mill Park, and we were looking at a park around here where there was a fish hatchery, depending on the season. So sometimes he would have his friends that were playing poker or doing something, and I would just go along on his whatever he was doing. Or he would have a new girlfriend or my stepmom eventually, and we would go to her house. But when he got the restaurant, he was open on Saturdays and Sundays and Fridays. So I saw an opportunity to leave school and go the entire weekend to their house, and I would work with him. Now, my stepmother at that time was still a hairdresser. She had her own little shop in the basement, and at her aunt's house, they had a shop. So, and her sons were young, and my brother was not interested in the business then because he was doing construction business with my uncle. So I really got to spend some one-on-one quality time with my dad every Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, and then go home to my mom. And at 12 years old, 13, 14, we're pretty much just making pizza boxes, making dough, rolling the dough, proofing the dough, making more pizza boxes, cleaning, and cashing out people at the register or taking orders or answering the phone and anything your parent tells you to do. And he'd give me a little money, and I felt great about it. And that just continued. And I really learned how to make all the subs and all the sandwiches and the pizzas and just cross training, just being there. And eventually I became a server, a waitress, and that's where I found my kind of my niche. I felt better out in the dining room for a while and hostessing and um, just managing the dining room. And then I became the dining room manager. And then eventually I went back to line cooking with different chefs. And so I got to do everything. But when my dad died in February, we didn't have family get together and we didn't have a celebration of his life. And we didn't have he died of COVID in Florida and our family is all dispersed. There was about a 5-day opportunity of me to get to Florida, and um, my brother could have arranged it for me to kind of only for a short while get in there to talk to my dad, but he was already um, on a partial um, breathing machine, partially, and so and he was out like anesthetized, and but I knew he could hear me, but I wasn't going to make it there, and I knew I wasn't going to, and we had had plans for me to get together with him on February 28th. I was going to go down to Florida and be with him. He was planning on getting out of the hospital. He had gone in with a small heart attack and pneumonia in January. And he called me in January, and it was the last time we spoke. And he said, I'm going home. And I said, where are you? He said, I'm leaving intensive care. Didn't you know I was in intensive care? No, nobody told me he was in intensive care. So things may have been different had I known he went into intensive care with a heart attack and pneumonia, because the last 3 times he had problems, I went down, other than one time. So um, I really felt perplexed. It was kind of like an ambivalent grief. It was kind of like a complicated grief. It was an anticipatory grief. I didn't know. It was like an absent grief. I didn't know whether to grieve. It was complicated. Like I'm not there. And when he died, because then everything he had always told me in every phone call didn't happen because it couldn't happen because of the circumstances of his death, he was buried at Cape Canaveral because he was a veteran in the Navy. And we didn't get to say our goodbyes, and nobody did. And I believe my nephew went up there and was able to go in for 15 minutes every couple hours, every hour. And that gave me some comfort to know that his someone was there. So thank you, Vincent. And um, when somebody is dying and you can't be there, you hope that the people that are there will go for you and say something, do something. So I was very glad that my nephew did. Um, and my brother and I stayed in touch, and my aunt and I stayed in touch, his sister. But it was this feeling of I want to run to him, but then I can't. I can't. So there had to come a moment of I let go, like just he's in the active dying stages. He was suffering. He's 90 years old. He had COVID. He had pneumonia. He had double pneumonia. His kidneys were failing. He's dying. Um, and I just remember the day he died. thinking this was so unnecessary. That's what I thought. Like, so unnecessary to die like this. And this was nothing like you planned. You planned on your body coming home and us celebrating you and eating pizza and wings and ribs and stuff, right? And talking shit about you or talking good about you, but you planned on something. He didn't plan on a formal funeral because he didn't believe in that. He didn't believe in a formal wake where people saw him, but he did believe in a private viewing if anyone in the family needed that for closure, like my two aunts, his sister-in-law and his sister, and me and my brother and grandchildren, if they needed that. And then one cousin that was his godson. He felt like if those people need that, every time we talked, he would talk about when I die. I want you to know when I die. Well, none of that was, so it just went out and that is life. And the only thing God promised us is we would have grief in life, trials, tribulations, sudden terror, fear, anxiety, and grief, and tears, sorrow. And that would not end until a new world, a new paradise in heaven. We would have no more grief, no more sorrow, no more nothing. So grief is not a disorder, but it can become disordered if it if we get stuck in any portion of grief. So there's basically 4 types of grief, but there's actually 16 that are like, I want to say, babies of the 4. So I'm going to read them to you if I can without losing you here. And then there's things that can happen. First, I want to talk about normal grief, which is somebody dies, you love them, it's a loss. You go through a divorce. It can be anything. It can be a divorce, lose your house, lose your job, any kind that would be considered a societal, like a norm in society for you to grieve. Like you've had a loss. Everyone can acknowledge that's a loss, and you're grieving right now. Anything that somebody would say, I give my condolences to you. I'm so sorry. A person can experience all of these things. So, physical reactions to grief, an actual tightness in your chest. And that could feel and look very much like a panic attack. It can send you to the hospital thinking you're having a heart attack. Feeling weak, just wiped out, exhausted. Lack of energy. Heart palpitations, again, that could plummet into anxiety, heart, panic attack, restlessness. You can appear like you're hyper, manic, tearfulness, and at any given moment, because what triggers grief can be a song, can be a place you're at, a food you're eating, a aroma, a cologne they wore, a perfume they wore, a picture you see, a movie you're watching that they like, a TV show you always watch together, anything. And so many more things. And then examples of behavior to grief. These are really interesting because so many people that get up in years are losing spouses and parents, and then all of a sudden they're forgetful, or they have confusion and agitation, and they can actually appear absent-minded, and this can make them worry about having Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementias. And then they could have very vivid dreams of the person they lost, or the pet they lost, or the baby they lost in a miscarriage, um, in a birth. Um, there's so many levels of grief. There's delayed grief. I'm going to go ahead and try to do this without it going off. Let's hope it doesn't go off. Emotional reactions to grief: anger, shock. I'm stuck in anger, shock. I go between anger and denial. And this is just normal grief: anger, shock, denial, just being numb, numbness, can't feel anything, loneliness, definitely, relief, which could then cycle into guilt, apathy, irritability, agitation, misplaced anger. Social reactions to grief can be suddenly throwing yourself into work and working too much, doing behavior you never did before, just burying your head and working. Isolation, withdrawing from friends, family, any relationships, and then having difficulties with them. Avoidance of all people. Work, you can avoid work, you can avoid everything. And you can start relying on substances, or if you do have substances in your life, maybe you drink wine, maybe you smoke cigarettes, maybe you drink coffee, maybe you eat food. You can do too much. You can start relying on substances, and that includes everything that you put into your body and you do to your body that um, would even be considered normal stuff. Like if you smoked pot, or you smoked a cigar, or you drank a little beer or wine, or you ate carbs, or whatever, or processed food or fast food, you could suddenly start comforting yourself with substances, neglecting your care but caring too much for others. Okay, so basically, the weight and the pain of grief is a different shape and weight for every person at different times. So let me go ahead and tell you the different types of grief, and then in each video I'll go over real examples of these things and what we can do to conquer a little bit at a time each kind of grief there is. Anticipatory grief, and everyone has this at some time in your life. An impending loss is coming up, either of a job, and it could be you're getting promoted to another job, a good move, a loss of a home. You're going to move away from family, friends, your job, your coworkers, doing something new that can actually cause anticipatory grief. A elderly parent, or a parent that's sick, you already know they're going to die. Somebody that has a terminal illness, could be anybody you know, or progressive illness that's chronic and getting worse. It can even be, and I have this often about my cat. He's been with me for 12 years now, and we've been alone. And I can already think ahead to when he's not with me and start grieving. And um, it can be any of those things, just a fear of losing. Uh, so then the reactions to that is to remove yourself from starting to take space away from the person, the fur baby, the relationships, and avoiding and because you don't want to feel so much pain. But there's a positive side to anticipatory grief also, where you are kind of preparing in kind of like small burials a little at a time. So it's like I've always said in my videos, I kind of try to taper off of everything. When I was on opiates for pain conditions, I just tapered off over Labor Day weekend in 2009 off of everything, and then I continued to taper off. I did that with coffee. I did that with everything. I did that with food until major grief. Then I started like eating my emotions. So, um, but sometimes it's okay to eat our grief, and that would come in memory food. And I remember I did this with my grandmother when she died, my mom's mom. She died the week of Thanksgiving, and she always made the turkey stuffing and the turkey dinner and everything. And having grown up with her in my home and a few cousins, her teaching us, we were able to pull together a Thanksgiving dinner the days before her funeral, after her funeral, and sit around a table and eat on my mom's side of the family. And it was like my grandmother was right there, because we were able to replicate her turkey stuffing, her gravy, her everything. So yesterday, I finally I wanted to watch the Buffalo Bills game, and I had worked, and I got home just in time to get to the game, and I thought I want to get pizza, and I had been thinking about I had a coupon for a neighborly place that I love to go to. And I always have like a standing order. I'll either get a fish fry during Lent season when they have it, or I'll get an eggplant sandwich, or I'll get pizza. And I love the vegetarian slices of pizza they make. So I always do that. And I was going to treat myself and do that. But I kept getting a little nudge that I wanted my dad's pizza. And I kept feeling like I wanted to call my dad. And I would normally call him during football season because he was a Giants fan, New York Giants, but his second team of choice was the Buffalo Bills. So if the Giants didn't win, he went with the Bills. But we would always talk politics, we would talk football. So as this campaign season is rearing up, as football is coming on, I'm thinking more of my dad. And I bought everything I needed to make my own pizza. I made the dough, but I wanted to see his name on the box of pizza coming to me. I wanted to take that first bite, crunch into the pizza. So I posted the video. So that's the intro to unboxing grief. Um, so anticipatory grief, we can start to do those things. We can start preparing those foods that maybe they're not eating anymore. We can start doing things that remind us of when they were well. So there's a positive side of tapering off with that. Complicated grief is really a strange one because it also is an ambivalent grief. And we can get stuck in complicated grief that can become chronic grief. So these all kind of catapult on each other. And it usually just occurs when people get stuck in any part of grief. So a person might be angry, and that turns to depression, that then they turn on themselves, which can be dangerous. It can also be depression that really is anxiety and isolation from everybody that is still close to you in your life. Um, the article I'm reading says it can be beneficial um, because it's one of the more difficult griefs to go to counseling for. Um, but I just want to say, and all of these things you can get counseling with, but my experience with therapy is you could end up in therapy a long time if you're with a counselor that sees you as stuck in grief, or they can label you into, well, from what's happening in your life, you got perfectly good reason to grieve, so I'm just going to keep seeing you for this, and that doesn't help either. So there are natural losses in life, and complicated grief tends to catapult when, well, I would call that secondary grief. There's secondary grief. It goes more into chronic grief. You got stuck somewhere in denial, in avoidance with the denial, in isolating, avoiding. Maybe if a dear pet, which is like a child to you, dies, you don't want to get another pet because you don't want to feel that pain again. Grief is a reaction to loving. So if we didn't love, we wouldn't grieve. So it comes with life. There's no getting away from it. But then there's chronic, which is cumulative, and it's just too many losses at once. Um, and it lasts for a long time, and you really do have to see a therapist to kind of get a little help. Then there's a type of grief that a good friend of mine had, and she literally died of it. Um, it was a delayed grief, which I would say all of these can be put under the same thing. They all kind of fall into the same thing. But her doctor diagnosed her with severe delayed grief reaction. All of a sudden, her complete body started breaking down, and she started having emotional behavioral responses to having lost her mother when she was 5 or 6 years old on the Christmas holiday. And then when her dad died, that kind of reminded her of her mother dying. And now anything that came up around Christmas or Father's Day or his birthday or her birthday or anything just threw her into distress, really bad distress, where she couldn't get out of bed, she couldn't take care of herself, she didn't eat, she hardly ever slept, even though she was in bed. The pain in her body got worse and worse. And all of the physical things came on her really strong. So delayed grief is really, really sharp feelings all at once that just flatten a person because they disassociated from the trauma. It was part of trauma grief. So losing a parent is traumatic, but if there was an accident involved and you were there, and her mother had died in a skiing accident, um, that was supposed to be a fun, like a snow sledding accident, which was supposed to be a fun thing, and uh, went straight on into a tree and died. So she was the oldest of the kids and had to go right into responsible taking care of the rest of the kids and getting them away from the scene. And she masked it. She totally went into like be mommy mode, do everything mommy did for her dad, for the kids, caretaker. And she totally disassociated from all the feelings she had during the time of the accident, the ambulance coming, the goriness of the scene, the blood in the snow, everything. She just totally wiped it out. And it started coming back to her in really bad, uh, horrific panic attacks of where she saw it in flashbacks. So that can happen with delayed grief. Distorted grief is sort of like exaggerated grief, but it's a separate category. And it's a self-destructive grief. It's when you turn your grief towards you and others. So it's kind of like it's a grief that can land you in a hospital because you're a danger to yourself and others. It's it's a feeling of this was unjust, this was unfair, and there is a feeling of I'm going to get back whoever did this, who caused this grief in my life. I'm going to get them back. And anger is the main thing. And I think I'm a little bit there sometimes. To be honest, I think I'm there. Cumulative grief is just when one thing happens after another. And why we see people saying, well, if you had a divorce and a parent died and a dog died and you were in a hurricane and all these things happened and you had a new job and you moved, that's too much stress, right? It's cumulative grief. It's an overload of bereavement. And people often get to a point where they just don't want to do anything anymore. They're like, I can't do it anymore. Um, I can't go on loving. I don't want to face this life that's going to hurt me. It feels very personal at that point. Like, why am I being targeted for this? Exaggerated grief, like distorted grief, can get weird. Um, it's disruptive. It will disrupt your night, your days. There can be suicidal, self-harm, substance abuse, and really exaggerated fears, like fears that don't make any sense, that cannot be substantiated by reality. So your brain can go somewhere like, I was wearing a plaid shirt on the day my mother was in the snow sledding accident for my friend. And she did have these moments. I was wearing a plaid sweater or shirt, so I don't wear plaid because something bad will happen. So it's kind of like not really it's kind of like a superstition of things start thinking it goes bigger. It can actually become a psychiatric disorder of psychosis where you start to think, if I go down that street, so and so died in a car on that street. If I go down that street, it's exaggerated and it's horrible. I'm glad I've never had that, but I know people that have. Secondary loss is when grief is when it affects so many areas of your life. Something happens, your world is blown up, but it affects your job, your finances, your family, your health, everything, and a whole bunch of people around you. And we're going to get back to talking about when we tell our stories to make sure they're correct, because everyone that is accused, every allegation that is made of child abuse, of emotional abuse, of sexual abuse, of negligence, of being a bad mom, being a bad dad, being a bad whatever, all of these things have secondary losses that continue. And it stems from an original loss experienced. Okay. Um, Masked grief is sort of like absent grief when somebody dissociated from it. So it can impair and hinder life functioning because you couldn't grieve. Nobody would let you grieve, or somebody said get over it, or that's not really something to grieve about. All of these things come from being around people in society that have said you've grieved long enough, get over it, or you're not grieving properly, or you can always have another baby, or you will love again. There'll be another relationship for you, or that's just part of life. So kind of like poo-pooing your feelings, saying, well, you know, or oversimplifying it and not feeling like you were heard or seen at all. All of these griefs come from not being able to grieve, not being able to feel what you feel and express what you want to express and behave the way you want to behave. They really do. And the one that is the most interesting to me, because I'm kind of in that, and I have a couple family members that are in that too, and friends, is disenfranchised grief, which is ambiguous. And I'm going to read it to you because I can't explain it as well as I can read this. Grief can be disenfranchised whenever you feel that your loss isn't validated by others. So it's kind of like all of them. This can happen when a culture or society doesn't recognize your loss. For example, there can be a strong stigma attached to death that results from an overdose or suicide, and your feelings of grief can be discounted. Now, I want to talk about suicide for a minute because in internet culture, we're being told, if you notice, there's kind of a trend going on where people are saying, my loved one succumbed to mental illness. They don't want to use the words, they killed themselves. They have to say, they unalived themselves. They don't even say that. They just say they succumbed to mental illness. So when you have a person that is bipolar, like Naomi Campbell, not Naomi Campbell, Naomi Judd. I'm sorry, I don't know why I was thinking Glad Campbell. Naomi Judd. Oh, I know why I was thinking Glad Campbell. I was going to talk about Alzheimer's. Naomi Judd. Ashley Judd was very quick to say her mother battled hard mental illness and succumbed to it. Didn't she used terms like self-inflicted, was not going to say suicide, was not going to say my mother turned the gun on herself, was not going to say um, my mother killed herself. Now that's part of Ashley's own grief process and how she's dealing with it, and then went on to protect Winona when things that uh, Naomi wrote about Winona that was found at the death scene um, might have caused more depression or reactionary suicide. So she, uh, in finding the note that her mom wrote, like, don't let Y come to my funeral, she's crazy or something like that, by the medical examiners and everybody reporting it, Ashley had issue with that because that could cause her sister to, these two women were so close, it could cause her sister to react in a way of self-harm. So disenfranchised grief, it's ambiguous. You know the person has been suffering. You're kind of preparing like anticipatory grief. You know if a person is depressed all the time and they are suicidal. And those of you that have friends that are in clinical depression or always in anxiety and depression or always, or maybe uncontrollable bipolar, they're up, they're down, and they're a danger to themselves when they are down or when they're manic. You're preparing for the fall. You're always preparing for the fall. And that's a very ambiguous kind of grief. Um, it also can come from abandonment issues. So you're ready for the shoe to drop. Um, and these are just examples I'm giving. I'll go back to reading. For example, I read that. Alternately, perhaps the death of someone others think you shouldn't grieve for because they were suffering or they were a bad person. They may have been an abusive partner, or and I kind of experienced this with my ex-husband when he died 2 years ago. I realized we had not spoken in quite a while, and um, I experienced people on one side of my family that were kind of like, well, why are you grieving him? You know, he did this to himself. He got him. Grief, we grief is a wild mother. You can't. No, it just it has a life of its own. You got to let it run its course and manage it and feel it, and that's the only way you can move through it. So it can be a very abusive parent. It can be a very abusive child. It can be a child that has caused you nothing but heartache, but you're still going to grieve. It could be a gang member. Um, it could be somebody that has done horrible things. It could be a same-sex partner, and you feel embarrassed to grieve that person. There's nobody to talk to about it, maybe. Maybe not in our world today, there would be people, but it could have been, it still can be if it's closeted. So anytime the loss is not recognized, it could be a pet, but most often it's people that die from their own lifestyle, or it's people that die, like people that are drug addicts that die from drugs. Well, they led a bad life. Why are you grieving them? It could be people that had traumatic brain injury and the progression was going to be that they were going to die, so you should be happy that they're not suffering. It could be a pregnancy that just didn't happen the way you wanted. Um, you lost your baby, but your baby's not really lost. Your baby is with you forever. But that can become an exaggerated grief where people get into distorted grief and they start to think the baby is whole, the baby is still alive with them, the baby is blaming them. There's this soul on the other side of the world that's wondering, Mommy, why couldn't you keep me safe? Or why did you let that car hit us? Or whatever. It can take on a whole life of its own. It could be a lot of self-blame with miscarriages and losses of babies. And typically, stillbirths, and I saw this when I was counseling pregnant teenagers at Teen Family Team for Monroe County in Rochester, New York. I worked 2 years with pregnant teenagers in all different capacities. Mainly their entire pregnancy, I was with them, sort of like a doula would be now, a birth doula. You're with them, you're with their whole family, and you're helping them to stay in school, navigate their family, the father of the baby's family, work everything out for the health of the baby and the health of the family. And um, we would several times we would have young girls that would have stillbirths. And at that time period in the 80s, early 90s, mid 80s to early 90s, if there was a stillbirth, there was a big investigation. If there were other children, they were taken away because of the way the baby looked when they were found with blood pooling and bruising. So I started meeting with the medical examiner to learn about stillbirths and why they happen. And I did a presentation for 300 caseworkers, child protective workers, foster care workers, medical workers, where I founded a support group for Western New York for the SIDS Foundation, Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. And children were brought back to their parents because what was happening was there were repetitive pregnancies. Like if a young girl, maybe a 16-year-old, lost her baby to sudden infant death syndrome, and then maybe there was another child in the family and they lost that child too, they would get pregnant right away. And what I would see is they would name their baby exactly what the previous dead baby was. And I saw this in my own family where I think it was just trying to carry on the name, where my dad's mom had a baby in the old country and his name was Francesco. And I remember my grandmother showing me pictures of him when he was dead. I didn't know he was dead, but she told me he was dead. I just thought he was in a nice christening outfit with his eyes closed. And she said, "No, that's my first baby. He died. That was the first Francesco." But then I knew I had an Uncle Frank. So what she did was with her next boy, she named, and it's very common. So this happens a lot with ambivalent and distorted and exaggerated grief is you haven't really grieved the first child and you're very overprotective of that second child and um, they're usually very anxious and worried because you've overprotected them or you've tried to toughen them up so that they'll live and made them the over responsible one so they worry about everything. There's and so I followed women for 5 years from the pregnancy to when the baby was 5 years old. So I got to do a lot of research, and that's what I wanted to do with my life until I got sick. And so I went back to food after I got off disability, right? But all of this still interests me. Um, so um, telling a woman to just get over it or have another baby, you could have another baby. It's sort of like saying, think about when our pets pass away that are our children, right? I have been alone with my cat for 12 years. If somebody told me just, I would die. I would die. Just, just get a new one. When my former cat died in 2010, I did not want another cat until 2012. I don't want to love like that and lose like that. And I had to remind myself that's part of life. So people can get stuck in grief where they don't want to get too close to anybody because they keep losing people they don't want to lose again. Really important for us, those of us that come from families that have some trauma and dysfunction, to try to keep being close to people with the knowledge that we're going to all experience loss eventually. So I wanted to talk about that. And then there is traumatic grief. So my friend Deb would have been traumatic grief, exaggerated grief, distorted grief, and delayed grief because her grief came from trauma. So it's the unexpected, violent death of a person. And it causes impairment with your life daily. And there are people that are on disability from it. It's a horrifying event that ends a person's world. Traumatic grief is often accompanied with survivor guilt and a moral injury. So I remember my friend telling me, as I would try to tell her to move on and to try to celebrate those days, and I could kick myself now for that, but I didn't know better. And really, in social work, when I was in school, we covered grief, 4 kinds of grief, not 16 kinds, and all the things that could happen from grief. We did a basic, I went to RIT social work program when it was there, and we would often pair up with Robert's Wesleyan, and we just didn't cover more than four uh, kinds of major grief and the stages of grief. But to really break down 16 types of grief, our life is filled with grief, and there will be grief in this life. There'll be different kinds and there'll be different reactions. So I want to give props and rights to Talkspace therapist Ashley Ertl, and she's a LCSW. Uh, for this article, but there's many articles that are just exactly like this. So if you were to look up the stages of grief, the types of grief, you're going to find all these kinds of grief. And they all kind of build on each other. What's important to know is that grief in and of itself is not a disorder. It's a stage of life. It's a consequence of loving. And we have to keep loving. And to allow people to have their feelings and express the way they are, unless you're getting stuck in some of these really bad reactions to grief, then go get your therapy and do what you can to work through it. So I know we don't talk about it much in the survivor community because we're so big on being survivors and thrivers that we don't want to talk about it. But when we find ourselves falling back into bad behaviors or behaviors that are so bad, not desirable, not the best for us, or in a bad headspace, um, I just know that I have been eating my emotions. There's 20 pounds on me of eating my emotions. And now I'm moved into a fasting, feasting lifestyle, which I'll just show you really quick, which I'm going to talk about later more, is Fast Like a Girl by Dr. Mindy Pels. And being past menopause, there's a whole slew of things that we need to be aware of to take that belly fat off that's dangerous. And she has a book out about navigating postmenopause, menopause, and why we need carbs every now and again. And we can fast, but we can't do what we did back then. So I had gotten into starve myself and then allow myself a treat once in a while. And then intermittent fasting, I was doing all wrong. I was going 16 to 18 to 20 hours without eating and then trying to eat everything I wanted in a small window of time. So I wasn't digesting it well, not feeling very good. And then I was going on long fasts and then uh, reintroducing food. And all of this was a grief reaction. Um, so food can be used as a substance in grieving, and then some people don't eat. So, but then there's the positive food memories, like what I did yesterday, because I was very careful to share my pizza with my neighbor, share my sandwich with my neighbor, cut my sandwich into a half, and freeze the rest of it. And so I just took a little taste of everything and shared and didn't feel like I overdid. And I think once we acknowledge we're eating our grief, we're we're masking our grief, we're smothering our grief with food, our feelings, our emotions. Once we say it out loud, and that acceptance is the first thing. I've admitted, right, that I'm overeating because I am angry. I am sad. I am pissed off and taking names angry. I want to get to the bottom of this angry. Um, Never mind the other side. There is no other side to this. I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to poke a hole in everything that seems weird. Okay. So, um, once I admit that I'm doing that, I'm free to breathe and I'm not hungry. Not crazy hungry. I'm not. It's like, oh, okay, I'm doing that. I'm so in any stage of grief, and I think during the pandemic we all experienced crazy grief, isolation. Has the world gone nuts? Who do we believe? What do we do? Can I get in trouble for doing this? Should I hold my breath? What should I do? And a lot of us did hold our breath and we got through it together, but alone. And I thank God for all of my friends that I had online, that we were all going through this together. So if we didn't have the internet, but there were a lot of people that couldn't get on the internet because they were isolated in other ways. And that's really sad that they were that isolated, that they were that shut out. If I think of the elderly, I think of people that maybe had mistakes in their life or characteristics or were falsely accused, people that were canceled during the pandemic, people that were falsely accused or allegations were made and they were just cut, gone. So that's why I want to kind of piggyback this on our Me Too stories and our truths, how we have to be so careful that they're more correct than filling in the blanks of what we don't know. Okay, that's all I wanted to say today. And I will come back and go through each kind of grief every Monday. Take care, everyone. And if you hung in that long, thank you and have a nice day. Bye bye.